What's up, y'all? Welcome to Political Fight Club. I'm Robert Durden. In this episode I was mentioning earlier, we're going to be talking about Matt Taibbi's The Divide. I've been reading that over the last couple of weeks for you guys. We're on the third to last chapter here. It's called Little Frauds, and then the next chapter is called Big Frauds. This episode is mostly about, in this chapter, is mostly about how people that try to get on welfare in this country will often have their Fourth Amendment rights, which is you can't be illegally searched or seized, because what they'll do in a lot of these districts or a lot of these cities is, if you want to get on welfare, they have to send somebody in to look through your belongings, your apartment, wherever you happen to live, to see if you lied on the paperwork to apply for welfare in the first place, which is a blatant violation of the Fourth Amendment. And of course, this is a tool to basically keep poor people in line and violate their constitutional rights. And then I'm going to talk about specifically a young lady named Maria Espinoza, who this exact thing happened to. Some dude knocks on her door, in the middle of the day after she applied for welfare, and goes through her every little belonging, goes into your bathroom, goes through your underwear drawer, checks everything to see if you lied in any way on your paperwork, and basically just a way to violate your Fourth Amendment rights, but also bully you and, keep these people in line. And then the last part, we're going to talk about how this really goes back to Bill Clinton. I'll read you one more small synopsis at the end on that. And then it'll kind of hint towards why it is that we do this to poor people, and how people that collapse economies like the Wall Streeters did when they, created the subprime mortgage crisis and collapsed our economy, but also other economies across the world by their reckless gambling. They never see the inside of a jail cell, but worse than that, they don't get searched. Their Fourth Amendment rights never get touched, because the system works in such a way where it's so laborious and financially difficult to go after rich people. But these people, poor people, get messed with all the time because the system, the judicial system, is rigged against them. They don't have the money nor the time to go fight a lot of these things. They end up on welfare in this case for this chapter, and they end up being completely scrutinized and lose their constitutional rights simply because they're poor. And that's the point of this chapter. So I'm going to read to you first about Maria Espinoza. Give me about 8 to 10 minutes to read these 6 or 7 pages here, guys. Maria Espinoza was a pioneer. The sifting through the dresser drawer search she experienced in the early years of the George H.W. Bush presidency was an informal precursor to a Minority Report style program that, in the Bill Clinton years, would become formalized in her new home county of San Diego. In San Diego County, from the late 90s on through today, this is written in 2013, the state preemptively searches for evidence of fraud in the homes of tens of thousands of people who have applied for or are applying for cash assistance via CalWORKs, or needy families, or TANF, what we used to call welfare. Today, every single person who applies for aid and is accepted has to be preemptively searched. These people are almost all non-white, and all while in LA in the late 1980s, the person visiting the home of someone like Maria was just a social worker from the local welfare office. The state has since upgraded. In San Diego, now it's a law enforcement official, a representative of the district attorney's office, who comes in to look through your underwear drawer. The city has a team of investigators whose sole purpose is to conduct the searches for this program, which is called Project 100%, or P100 for short. 100% compliance. That's the idea. That's not Orwellian at all. No outliers, no excuses. Fraud must not be tolerated, not even the smallest kind. So the program must be large, and appropriate resources most naturally to be devoted to crime detection. In just 1 year, 2011, the county conducted an astonishing 26,000 home searches in this manner. P100 generates by the thousand stories that sound like testimonials culled from refugees of some distant low-rent third-world despotate. The stories are terrible, humiliating, and abusive. Quote, "The first case I ever had was a Vietnamese woman who had lost one of her children in a refugee camp," says Joni Halpern, a San Diego lawyer who has spent the last decade defending people on public assistance. Quote, "She'd come to America after suffering all kinds of abuse. She was a rape victim. She applies for public assistance, and a few days later there's a knock on the door. The investigator comes in and immediately starts yelling at her, telling her he can take her children or take her to jail if she's lying about not having a boyfriend. Quote, he starts going through her dresser drawer, He opens her underwear drawer, sticks a pencil in there, and uses the pencil eraser to pull out a pair of panties that he thinks are too sexy for a woman living alone. And still holding them up by the eraser, he waves them at her, accusing her of having a man in the house. That woman didn't open the door for anyone for any reason for over a year after that, Halpern says. Kate Bjorland, a white woman, applied for welfare in her 20s when she was jobless and trying to raise her 2-year-old son by herself. She remembers the caseworker coming through her door and immediately telling her that he can arrest her on the spot if she lied on her application. She remembers him going through everything in her apartment, commenting that the fridge was too stocked with food, sifting through her drawers, her medicine cabinet, even examining the stuffed animals in her son's crib. Then she remembers how he went into the bathroom and whipped around in an apparent eureka moment after finding 2 toothbrushes in her toothbrush holder. "What do you need 2 toothbrushes for?" he snapped. "I use them," she protested. Years later, when Bjorland became one of a number of women who joined in a lawsuit against the county challenging the legality of the P100 program, she was again asked about the 2 toothbrushes by one of the county's lawyers. Quote, "He asked me, 'Why do you need 2 toothbrushes?' And I turned it right back around at him. 'Let me ask you something. How many toothbrushes do you have?' I said. And he was like, 'Okay, forget about that question.'" In those tens of thousands of searches over the years, P100 investigators have looked into every nook and cranny, finding tins everywhere. They rejected an applicant who shared an apartment with a roommate for failing to properly label her food in the refrigerator. How could the state be sure, after all, that the applicant wasn't illegally sharing food with her roommate? They rejected a woman for having a Victoria's Secret bra. "How can you afford this?" the investigator asked, again holding up the item with the favored pencil eraser end. "For having too big a jacket in the closet? It must be a man's, not yours." Or for having a teenage son whose pants were too ghetto, too baggy. Again, it must be a man's clothes. Searchers looked in dresser drawers, bathrooms, freezers, refrigerators, under and behind couches, everywhere. And eventually, of course, after 20 or 30,000 of these searches, a few of these mostly black and Latina women on benefits who were in a job counseling class together got together and decided, with the help of a few do-gooder local lawyers, to sue. After all, how could a preemptive search by law enforcement officials possibly be constitutional? Didn't the state need a warrant or a probable cause to conduct any kind of intrusive search, even of a car, much less someone's home? That was the idea behind Rocio Sanchez et al. Versus the County of San Diego, a case filed with the aid of the local ACLU in 2004. Karen Bjorland, the woman who had too many toothbrushes, was one of the 6 litigants in the class action case. You would think this would be a slam dunk civil liberty case, but you'd be wrong. In fact, courts have been slowly chipping away at the Fourth Amendment protection against unreasonable searches and seizures for a long time. And the dominant theme in this gradual legal erosion has been an innovative new form of institutional racism and a creepy inverse correlation between rights and need. Over and over again, we hear that if you owe money in a certain way or if you receive a certain kind of public assistance, you forfeit this or that line item in the Bill of Rights. If you're a person of means, you get full service for all 10 amendments, and even a few that aren't listed. But if you owe, if you rent, if you get the slightly thinner, more trabecular version of the Fourth Amendment, the First Amendment, and the Fifth and the Sixth, and so on and so on. It's not that it's written anywhere that if you're black and you live in the projects, you don't get protection against illegal searches. It just sort of works out that way. And if this makes any sense at all, it's not about skin color. This is a cultural kind of bias. White people who live the wrong way also get caught in the net. And as the income gap gets bigger and bigger, more and more white people are being pushed behind that line. The major precedent for Sanchez v. San Diego's suit was a Supreme Court case from the 70s called Wyman v. James. In that one, a black single mother named Barbara James applied for and received welfare. After some time on public assistance, a caseworker called and asked to set up an appointment to see James in her home. James told the caseworker she was happy to meet on neutral territory, but that she didn't see any need to let the caseworker into her house. The caseworker disagreed and nixed her benefits immediately. A lawsuit ensued, and it made it all the way to the Supreme Court in 1971, where the nation's top justices asked the question, does the Fourth Amendment apply to people on welfare? Justice Harry Blackmun, writing for the majority, explained that it did not. The state, Blackmun wrote, quote, has appropriate and paramount interest and concern in seeing and assuring that the intended and proper objects of that tax-produced assistance are the ones who benefit from it and the aid it dispenses. He added that, quote, surely it is not unreasonable that the state have at its command a gentle means of achieving that assistance. Writing the dissent in Wyman was Justice William Douglas, ably playing the supporting actor part of the concerned but habitually ignored civil libertarian. Most of the legal dramas resulting in lost rights over the years would feature the same mopey character. Douglas argued that the Wyman ruling was nuts because not just poor black ladies from the Bronx, but almost everyone lives off the government teat to one degree or another. Quote, we are living in a society where one of the most important forms of property is government largesse, which some call the new property. Defense contracts, highway contracts, and the other multifarious forms of contracts are another part. So are subsidies to air, rail, and other carriers. So are disbursements by government for scientific research. So are TV and radio licenses to use the airspace, which of course is part of the public domain. In '69, roughly $127 billion were spent by the federal, state, and local governments on social welfare. To farmers alone, almost $4 billion were paid. Almost 129,000 farmers received $5,000 or more, their total benefits exceeding $1.45 billion. If we eliminate Fourth Amendment protection for everyone who receives public assistance, he implied, where does it end? Who wouldn't have to let the government worker into his house? Would all 129,000 farmers have to let government agents into their homes to make sure if the subsidies reach the right targets? Quote, if you go by the logic of Wyman, says Halpern, anyone who claims a tax deduction could be searched. But Douglas was overruled, of course, because the implicit intent of Wyman, not its explicit intent, but very much the implied meaning, didn't cover everyone, just black welfare moms like Barbara James. No one else had to trade the Bill of Rights for government aid. So the state got to keep its quote-unquote gentle means of checking to make sure tax dollars were reaching the appropriate destinations. Incidentally, the court back then specifically noted that the gentle means was not made by police or a uniformed authority, and that the visiting agent was not a sleuth, but rather we trust a friend to one in need. 35 years later in Sanchez v. San Diego, the visiting agent would be transformed into a law enforcement agent and professional sleuth, and the friend in need, quote-unquote, would be someone who roots around in the underwear drawers with pencil ends. But the U.S. Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, led by an internment camp survivor named A. Wallace Tashima, nonetheless decided P-100 wasn't in any way unconstitutional, unconstitutional. Tashima's bizarre reasoning was that the P-100 visits were not searches under the Fourth Amendment, but even if they were searches, they were not unreasonable. Why are they reasonable? Because, Tashima said, the public, quote, has a strong interest in ensuring that aid provided from tax dollars reaches its proper and intended recipients. Jesus Christ! This is our court system for you, folks. So, the standard is anyone who receives aid from taxpayers foregoes his rights because the state, quote-unquote, has strong interest in rooting out fraud. But of course, not everyone who receives state aid foregoes his or her rights, not really. To whom does this legal principle apply? Well, we know to whom, but we can't put it on paper. It's like pornography. You know it when you see it. As Americans, we're all beginning to develop a second sense about who gets to feel the business end of this criminal justice system and when, and who doesn't, and why. That second sense we all carry around in our minds is our true government. It's very different from the Schoolhouse Rock official version, and different from the one we see celebrated every 4 years in our presidential campaign system. Schoolhouse Rock teaches us that everyone is treated equally under the law, and that our government is one we've chosen in free elections. But at the same time, we somehow know not to be surprised when that turns out to be completely not true. This has been hammered home to all of us in the recent years following the financial crash, when the dichotomy in the system has grown more and more visible, creeping higher and higher into our collective consciousness. For instance, while the San Diego District Attorney's Office spent more than a decade sifting through the thousands of dresser drawers and bringing felony cases all the way to court for frauds as small as $400, executives in the same general area of Southern California at companies like Countrywide and Long Beach Mortgage were pioneering a brilliant mass fraud scheme that involved the sales of toxic mortgage-backed securities. One of the favorite targets of that fraud scheme was government and taxpayer dollars. These companies, along with their bankers, loved more than anything to sell worthless mortgage bonds to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the government-backed housing agencies. Just one Southern California company called Countrywide dumped as much as $26.6 billion on the taxpayer and the state when it sold overvalued bonds to Fannie and Freddie. Bank of America, its eventual parent company, sold another $6 billion to Fannie and Freddie. 15 other companies also targeted the federal government for hundreds of millions and billions more. The state of California's pension fund, CalPERS, was also the target of massive fraud schemes as banks, mortgage lenders, and ratings agencies conspired to sell California workers billions more in worthless securities in exchange for their life savings. By the time all of these companies were finished first inflating and then crashing a huge global asset bubble based on overvalued mortgages, the world had lost trillions of dollars. One extremely conservative estimate by the IMF puts the losses at $4 trillion. But despite having been warned about the possibility of widespread mortgage fraud by the FBI as early as 2004, financial cops in the regulatory agencies like the SEC and the OCC didn't respond to the problem at all until well after the crash. When they finally did respond, they did so by bringing civil suits against companies like Countrywide, JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Wachovia, and over, and others and others. And in the 21 biggest federal settlements over mortgage fraud abuses, $300 million from State Street for lying to investors, $153 million from Chase in the Magnetar settlement, and so on. Those companies and a few others paid a total of $26 billion in damages to the government. In every single one of those cases, the relevant companies were allowed to settle without admitting wrongdoing. Not a single individual was charged with any of those cases. Not a single individual had to pay so much as a dime of his or her own money in damages. No one's home was searched. No banker ever had someone pick up his underwear by a pencil and wave it in his face. $26 billion of fraud, no felony cases. But when the stakes are in the hundreds of dollars, we kick 26,000 doors in a year in just one county. Now this is the important part, real quick, just finish up, just synopsize here and then we'll move on. You can drive yourself crazy trying to figure out how this makes sense, financial or otherwise, but it does make sense. It's just not about money. It's about fucking with people. It's the logic of our new shadow government. It turns out that we're too lazy to govern ourselves, so we've put society on a bureaucratic autopilot. An autopilot turns out to be a steel trap for losers and a greased pipeline to money, power, and impunity for the winners. This goes far beyond the oft-quoted liberal cliche about how we now have two Americas, one for the rich and one for the poor, with different sets of laws and different levels of punishment, or more to the point, non-punishment for each of them. The rich have always gotten breaks, and the poor have always had to swim upstream. The new truth is infinitely darker and more twisted. The new truth is a sci-fi movie, a dystopia. And in this sci-fi world, the issues aren't justice and injustice, but biology and mortality. We have a giant meat-grinding bureaucracy that literally alters the physical makeup of its citizens, systematically grinding down the losers into smaller, meeker, lower race of animals, while aggrandizing the winners, making them bigger than life, impervious, and super people. Again, the poor have always faced the sharp end of the stick, and the rich have always fought ferociously to protect their privilege, not just in America, but everywhere. What's different now is that these quaint old inequities have become internalized in the second government, quote-unquote, a vast system of increasingly unmanageable bureaucracies spanning both the public and private sector. These inscrutable, irrational structures, crisscrossing back and forth between the worlds of debt and banking and law enforcement, are growing up organically around the pounding twin impulses that drive modern America. Burning hatred of all losers and the poor, and breathless, abject worship of the rich, even the talentless and undeserving rich. No one is managing these bureaucracies anymore. They are managing us. Just as corporations are brainless machines for making profits, this sweepingly complex system of public-private bureaucracy that constitutes our modern politics is just a giant brainless machine for creating social inequity. And I couldn't read it. I mean, you can tell Hunter S. Thompson was a huge influence on Matt Taibbi. That's how he writes, and that's why I'm enjoying this book so much. So I'm sorry that was a little bit long-winded, but now I couldn't have said it better, which is why I read it to you that way. But that's exactly what we have right now. The system that we have is so it's like a capitalist organism that's out of control. Like it's off the rails, and we're in end stage capitalism, and I'm not sure that we can get out ahead of it before it destroys itself anyway. That's why I'm a Marxist, is because Marxism is really just a critique of capitalism. It's not really a theory on its own. It's just a critique of capitalism. And in end stage capitalism, Marxism makes the most sense to me. So, but that explains to you exactly why these Wall Streeters never get touched, and the poor get destroyed with everything in our legal system, in our police system, and everything in our financial system, because this capitalistic organism is it's mutating and it's out of control, and this is what it manifests. So now I'm going to read to you about Bill Clinton real quickly here, because he really set the stage for this stuff, and this will be much shorter, I assure you. I'll try to do it in about 4 or 5 minutes, and then we'll be done in under a half hour. Okay, guys? High finance fraud cases are drawn out for dozens of reasons, including the obfuscatory efforts of superior defense lawyers and the overwhelming complexity of the crimes. But welfare fraud, these cases can be generated in the blink of an eye, often because a family member or a neighbor simply decided to pick up the telephone. Quote, "No one can snitch you off like your ex or your ex's girlfriend or your neighbor or your landlord," says one former California district attorney whose county in the late 1990s processed more than 100 fraud cases a month. Gustafson, the professor, recalls interviewing a single father named Jerome for a study she was doing on how well welfare recipients understood the rules. Jerome was raising his toddler son by himself. Why? Because back when he was living with the child's mother and her sister, the sister didn't like him and called the welfare office to snitch him out, hoping that authorities would kick him out of the house. But the consequence of that decision was that the authorities busted not Jerome, but the mother, for not registering Jerome as a resident in the home. The mother ended up doing a year in jail. Jerome and his son now rent out a room in a converted garage. New scene. The ad in Riverside, California, Press Enterprise is one of the big banner variety. Nicely placed in the Sunday edition. At 4 columns square, it's a nice size too, costing $1,000 to publish. The message is simple. The government of Riverside County, California, a politically conservative, mostly affluent region of East LA that extends to the Arizona border and includes resort town of Palm Springs, is looking for whistleblowers to aid the state in making fraud cases. Snitch network. What kinds of fraud cases? Big cases? Well, not exactly. The ad reads, $100 reward offered by Riverside County Department of Public Social Services. Dockets of the Riverside County court system show the following persons were convicted of welfare fraud on the date specified. And then the ad goes on to list the names and conviction dates of 6 persons convicted of improperly receiving benefits. The government of Riverside County, California essentially puts the heads of 6 welfare cheats on pikes and plants them in the public square for a month to send a message to the community. Yeah, shaming is definitely part of the motivation, sighs Philip Robb, a former prosecutor from neighboring San Bernardino County. Month after month, Riverside County runs the same ad and picks 6 new names each month to advertise. Like welfare recipients in general, the guilty are overwhelmingly female and usually non-white. Quote, "They don't do this to rapists or murderers," says Rob. "Not even pedophiles. It's incredible." No, the only offenders the local burghers will spend money to embarrass publicly are young, single, non-white mothers guilty of the crime of improperly receiving benefits. And as we've seen, it's a stretch to assume that they're all really guilty. The one thing we do know is that the people on this list every month are all flat broke and incapable of hiring a decent lawyer. And who knows, the fancy folk in Palm Springs might have an interest in shaming these people for that crime as well. All of this goes back to Bill Clinton. It's not a coincidence that the radical welfare reform took place on the same watch that now also saw radical deregulation of the financial services industry. Clinton was a man born with a keen nose for 2 things: women with low self-esteem and political opportunity. When he was in the middle of a tough primary fight in 92 and came out with a speech promising, quote, "to end welfare as we know it," he could immediately smell the political possibilities, and it wasn't long before this was the major plank in his convention speech and soon in his first State of the Union address. Clinton understood that putting the Democrats back in the business of banging on black dependency would allow his party to re-seize the political middle that the Democrats had lost when Lyndon B. Johnson threw the weight of the White House behind the civil rights effort and the war on poverty. If you dig deeply enough in America, the big political swings always have something to do with race. And Clinton's vacillating between cleverly packaged campaign to, quote, end welfare as we know it, was a brilliant ploy by the man Toni Morrison called the first black president to take back the southern white voters the Democrats had seemingly lost forever when they sent the FBI into Alabama and Mississippi in the 60s. That and the little rolled-up newspaper training session with rapper Sista Soulja allowed Clinton to take 4 of the 11 Confederate states, seizing ground no Democrat had won for more than 2 decades. But Clinton didn't just go after Republican votes. He went after the Republicans' money, too. He brought in a team of economic advisors who'd offered what was, for the Democrats, a bold new approach to the economy, an approach based upon balancing the budget on the one hand and deregulating Wall Street on the other. In the wake of the '08 crisis, Clinton is most frequently criticized for overseeing 2 radical changes to our regulatory structure. This is important. The repeal of the Glass-Steagall Act to allow the mergers of investment banks, commercial banks, and insurance companies, and the Commodity Futures Modernization Act of 2000, which deregulated the burgeoning derivatives market. That's it. Remember, I'm going to reread it. Repeal of Glass-Steagall and passing the Commodity Futures Modernization Act of 2000. Less commonly understood is that Clinton, Greenspan, Rubin, and Summers also oversaw the collapse of what are known as selective credit controls, the tools used to rein in irresponsible lending. Rules like the Federal Reserve's Regulations X and W, which mandated minimum down payments for things like home and automobile loans, were watered down, if not eliminated completely, during the Clinton years, and regulators under Clinton likewise refused to insist that banks and financial companies at least jack up their reserve capital to match all the crazy lending that they were doing. At a critical juncture in '93, for instance, Clinton's SEC considered a proposal to raise capital requirements in the then little-known derivatives market, but ultimately decided against it. The cumulative effect of all of this was an explosion of easy credit for the financial services sector, wedded to an across-the-board relaxation of economic regulation. Staffs were cut at all the major regulatory agencies, and banking watchdogs like the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency and Office of Thrift Supervision simply stopped pursuing criminal investigations. Groups that had referred thousands of cases a year to the Justice Department for prosecuting during the S&L crisis completely stopped that activity by the turn of the millennium. In 2009, the OCC referred 0 cases for prosecution. On the other hand, welfare fraud was prosecuted like never before, and welfare fraud investigators multiplied like rats in every state of the country, forming unions and lobbying agencies. Now, let's remember, Joe Biden was instrumental in all of this as well. Bill Clinton's political formula for seizing the presidency was simple. He made money tight in the ghettos and let it flow free on Wall Street. He showered the projects with cops and bean counters and pulled the cops off the beat in the financial services sector. And in one place, he created a vast new mountain range of paperwork, while in another, paperwork simply vanished. After Clinton, just to get food stamps to buy potatoes and flour, you suddenly had to hand in a detailed financial history dating back years, submit to wholesale invasions of your privacy, and give in to a range of humiliating conditions. Meanwhile, banks in the 90s were increasingly encouraged to lend and speculate without filling out any paperwork whatsoever, and eventually borrowers were freed of the burden of even having to show proof of income when they took out mortgages or car loans. So that tells you everything you need to know about how Clinton set this up, and again, Joe Biden was instrumental at this time doing exactly this. The crime bill passed back then, which is an enormously racist bill, basically creating the private prison complex. Biden did that as well. But I mean, now you can see that's why they call this chapter Little Frauds, is because the way that Clinton ran things is he deregulated the shit out of Wall Street and created a financially constricted, impoverished areas everywhere, basically taking away all of your rights simply because you're poor. So I hope that didn't go too long, guys. I will read Large Frauds, which is the second to last chapter, soon, and that will, I imagine, go into more detail about how these huge frauds never have to deal with any type of scrutiny or financial impact or, any type of legal repercussions whatsoever. So hope you enjoyed that, guys. Keep fighting the good fight out there. I'll talk to you later.